Wanjiru, let's talk about the debt situation in the country and the relationship between the country and the multilateral lenders, specifically the World Bank.
Right. Thanks. For the opportunity to bring this conversation to the fore. This week, as the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, which is a civil society coalition focusing on debt and pushing for accountability in public debt, we wrote a letter to the World Bank. And our complaint to the World, first, is to appreciate the support the World Bank gives the country, because we need that support to be able to undertake our development. In fact, looking at the figures, between 2014 and 2018, out of a development budget of about 2 trillion, which is the national development budget, the World Bank supported about 400 billion of it. So they are very significant. About 1/5 of Kenya's development budget is supported by the World Bank through loans. And the bank then does this through what is called the County Partnership Framework. The County Partnership Framework is where they agree on the projects and they agree this is how we'll implement them and monitor them and all of that. This is also guided by rules that govern the World Bank, including rules on governance, transparency, participation. However, and the reason we wrote the letter to the World Bank, the global head, regional head, Kenya head, is to say that they are not abiding by their rules in Kenya, because the County Partnership Framework has become a closed affair between the World Bank and Treasury. And this document is then not being monitored, not monitored by civil society, not monitored by parliament, and the public participation that's supposed to take place is not taking place. And part of the reason for this, from where we sit, is what we were discussing during the week, that when the Jubilee administration came in, they refused to sign the external partnership agreements, the bilateral agreements with different countries, until the citizen component was pulled out. So this government has shown itself to be inimical to public participation, sharing information, and then we've seen in the same stroke huge corruption in infrastructure projects that are being implemented contrary to the constitutional dictates on Article 201. All public finance matters must have public participation, accountability, and transparency. So the government is violating this. And then when the World Bank comes to work with the government, they are operating in an approach that also violates the constitutional requirements and the World Bank's own requirements. So we wrote a letter just saying, no, this isn't on. This is our observation after reviewing all your records and your reports. This is what we find to be the situation. Yes.
So what we are saying here is that the World Bank has its own internal mechanisms that call for engagement with the citizens of a country where it's lending.
Citizens and civil society.
And have we seen this happen in other countries?
We've seen it happen in other countries. So our study demonstrated that in Ghana, for instance, we had much more robust, the County Partnership Framework was actually popularized. So there were meetings with the citizens to say, this is what we are going to do. And we had several other examples where we saw a much higher level of participation. Here we found that the participation of the World Bank is limited to consultation. So during the development of the the county diagnostic report, civil society were invited. Usually those invites are based on like 2-3 days notice. There's a bank meeting, you go, you give your views, the report is then produced. That is, properly speaking, not proper participation. But in the county planning partnership framework, the previous one, because they are 5 years and then now we are developing the next one, we said that in the previous one, there was no public participation, there was no citizen engagement and civil society oversight over that. What is the fate of the present one, and we didn't get a response. We wrote a couple of letters last year, no response. So this year we decided, let us do our own review.
Okay.
Let us do consultations. Let us meet with civil society and ask them, we are finding there is no participation. Maybe
Has it occurred?
Maybe it occurred.
Yes.
And people, sure enough, had the same experience. So the World Bank has taken cue from governments. Because we know our government right now, there's an ongoing case. The BBI case is about following the law. And this government refusing to follow the law, refusing to obey, even contempt, being in contempt from rulings of the courts. So the World Bank, instead of coming to enforce its standards, as it traditionally would, has come and lowered its standard and been co-opted. Actually, we are very concerned that the World Bank and the IMF have been co-opted by government and are actually colluding against the people of Kenya. Why? We must say World Bank projects are better managed when we are presently looking at the debt register, and we find the performance of their projects is higher than the ones that are maybe supported by commercial debt and some of the bilateral ones. But mostly the commercial debt are the bigger problem. But even having said that, there is a lack of participation. Further, our last concern is the legacy projects. And we put this to the IMF during several meetings we've had to them, and now we are formulating a letter to them where we say these legacy projects are very expensive. Some of them have been inflated, that the return of investment is not there. Even Parliament has said this. Yet you come and continue lending to a country that is mismanaging major resources and taxing Kenyans to pay for corruption.
Yeah.
So the World Bank's own spending might be scrutinized, but they also lend a lot of technical support. They go beyond that. So we are saying, to the extent that you don't identify the gaps, you are colluding.
You're colluding with the government.
A corrupt government to defraud Kenyans.
Let's contextualize this from the African perspective and bring in two people who will help us with this conversation. One of them is Jason Braganza. He is the Executive Director of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. And the other one is Julius Kapwepwe. He is the Director of Programs, Uganda Development Network, and Coordinator of the East Africa Budget Network. Good morning to you, Jason and Julius.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So we are able to have a video connection with Jason, but not so fortunate with Julius. Technology issues. Let me start with you, Jason. From the perspective of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, what is it that this institution does, and how does it come into the conversation around the multilateral lending institutions such as the World Bank and IMF and governments?
Thank you very much, and for having us on this program. Maybe for ease of the mouthful of our name, you can just refer to us as AFRODAD. It might be easier for the listeners as well. So we are a Pan-African civil society organization that was established 25 years ago with the mandate of enhancing public participation and scrutiny on public debt issues. And our work then evolved over these past 2.5 decades to look at the broader financing aspects of our continent's development agenda. And within that context, a big component of it has relied on external financing, which comes from the multilaterals, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. So in the context of our conversation today, specifically, building up on what Wanjiru has said, it's also important to understand how the World Bank is organized. It has several layers within it. There's the World Bank, and then there's the World Bank Group. The World Bank is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Assistance, which is usually the part of the bank that does the concessional lending, granting, and project implementation. And then you've got the World Bank Group where you include the International Center for Settlements and Disputes and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency and the International Finance Corporation. And these three other arms are the ones that normally deal with the private sector, big mega infrastructure, the legacy projects financing that Wanjiru has spoken about. And I think when you bring the two together as the entire group, this is where you start seeing the gray areas. And this has been, something that has been a challenge, not just in Kenya, but across the continent. And in particular, when I was last on the show, we talked about the evolution of the type of financing that has been coming into the continent from the relatively cheap concessional financing that used to be the norm in the form of official development assistance and the grants from the World Bank, to now a heavier reliance or dependence on leveraging private finance, which brings in with itself all manner of complications and opportunities for opaqueness in how arrangements and agreements are discussed, negotiated, and implemented. And we're seeing a lot of this, particularly in the energy sector, in the infrastructure sector. The World Bank specifically, in Kenya, I think you remember the issues we've had with wind energy projects up in north part of Kenya in Turkana, the issues we had just outside of Nairobi on Ngong Hills with regard to the financing and the public consultation that was meant to have taken place, the environmental screenings and evaluations that were meant to have been done ahead of implementing these projects. So it is something that is systemic. It is a big challenge for civil society organizations to actually get these spaces and to have a conversation with the development partners. So this is something that has been going on for very many decades, and it is something that we've been continuously pushing and advocating for reform at the highest level of these multilateral institutions, especially the ones that are taking a big chunk of financing into our countries.
And Julius, in Uganda, is it the same? Is this also happening in Uganda in terms of the relationship between the World Bank, the government, and the citizens through various organs of citizens, let's say the civil society organizations or even direct citizen participation? Is there any form of citizen engagement before the World Bank rolls out a program or during implementation of a program?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'll answer that, but in a given context. And right away, I'll say that as Uganda Debt Network, as East African Budget Network, we are conceptually not against borrowing, but rather we are for responsible borrowing and lending. In other words, it's not just an affair of a given government, say in Africa or in the low-income countries, but rather also about the going zone onto the loan giver. That's the context of where we are coming from. The other bit for me, quickly, to answer your question slightly later on, is that the World Bank Group, as Julie has highlighted earlier on, we acknowledge a massive contribution. If you looked at Uganda as a case, we have been with the World Bank predating Uganda's independence in 1962. We also know that for a fact, Kenya, you have been with the World Bank predating 1964, certainly before your independence. You were already with a begging bow to the World Bank. So was Uganda and a number of other countries in East Africa, remembering East African harbors and the railways, which were being used to take resources from the hinterland of Eastern Africa to the Yorkshire for cotton in London and others. But it was you and I, our forefathers and mothers, that paid for that facility. So you can imagine the level of relationship at that time. So again, quickly on the participation, if I look at the case of Uganda, and quick at speed, looking at what is called diagnostic country assessment, where the World Bank comes and invites certain stakeholders for a discussion into what they would wish to see for a new country program, in this case across East Africa from the year 2021 to 26. The challenge or the shortfall thereof is that the selection of who participates, in addition to what Julius said on the 3 days notice or one, is that there is a kind of a random selection of who comes aboard. There is limited acceptance or taking up of new ideas that come into that kind of discussion. There's like a preset kind of goal or mindset for that matter. And unless you speak to what is within the confinement, the degree of receptibility becomes very, very limited. And subsequently, that means that wouldn't be participation. You would call it, if I could just speak any word, maybe pseudo-English, could be kind of aspiration. You are facilitated to think this direction, don't think the other independent one. That definitely becomes.
So you're saying essentially that there is an outcome that is already predetermined of this participation. To say that there are certain boxes that have already been created for this participation, and anybody who then is being called is going to fit into those boxes, and then we will be able to tick and say participation has taken place, but they've already been predetermined and prescribed.
Moreover, in a very short space of time, and outside that, then you might appear to be a bad boy or a bad girl, as the case may be. So what we are talking about really is to highlight the call and the cause for responsible borrowing and lending. You know, that's where we would be coming from, and that's what we are talking about this morning. There have been some level of space, but please, beyond, for instance, publish what you pay, because that's what the World Bank, for instance, Vice President Hafez Guranen will tell you that we do publish what you pay, and so what are you talking about, lack of information and participation? But we would wish to see a greater call to publicize what you fund. Many of us in Kiambu, many of us in Kajiado, and a number of areas across Kenya and Eastern Africa generally, Kivu area, south of Rwanda and Congo, in Rwenzori, in the case of Uganda, do not have access to the websites of the mighty. So publicize what you find, beyond just publish. Otherwise, you'd be told, no, this was on the website, we called people to come and make their input. But publicize, and also, and more so, where the particular projects are going to take place. Let the intended recipients be part of that discussion as conceptualization. When you don't do that, you find a big borehole has been constructed, but it has actually dodged the water point. A big water tank for cattle water provision and all that, like in the arid areas in Turkana and Karamoja areas, have been built. But because there was no local consultation with Thomas of that particular place, the exact water point where the water passes when it has rained is actually bypassed. So you'll find what the World Bank itself has called the white elephant for so much money that has been sunk in, and it is you, the taxpayers, the indigenous, not the government, but the government is playing a custodial role. It is you, the indigenous, the wananchi, who have to pay back that money. In Uganda, we've had cases where we've paid loans that were left here by the previous regime. So has been in Kenya.
Jason, just looking at still on that public participation issue and seeing some of the things that we see come about when these decisions are made, what are the far-reaching effects of proper, authentic public participation? Not these boxes that we are talking about that are pre-filled and prescribed. What are the benefits of public participation, and what are some things that you can actually avoid if you had proper public participation? And if we're looking at something, for some people with the World Bank, it seems such a big, amorphous, entity. We're not really sure how it happens, and we're just going to leave those discussions for government. Public participation of the citizenry, how does it affect these big financial decisions and agreements that are being made?
I think at the most basic level, but also at the most important level, is when you have proper, genuine public participation, you actually know what people want. And I'll illustrate this with an example. At AFRODAD, we are just in the process of commissioning a set of documentaries called Voices of the Indebted. which involves speaking to Kenya, to citizens across the continent, and asking them what does it mean for them to be when they hear about debt issues in their countries. And one respondent just said, from Kenya, said they live in Kibera, and just mentioned the infrastructure projects. And he just said, well, if in my opinion, I don't think financing the expressway should be a priority for the government right now, when in the midst of a pandemic, people are going hungry, children are not being able to attend school, and there's no functioning, proper universal access, functioning health system. And this puts into context what that means. If government and its development partners like the World Bank took time to sit down and actually listen to what citizens want, perhaps then they'll get a better understanding, a better flavor for what the needs are of citizens, and then decide how to then invest the billions of dollars that are being put in. And I want to echo that, this is not about saying that the investments that are being made are not good or they're not needed. The question is, are they the most pressing item that the country should be investing in at a particular moment in time? And I think when you don't do public participation in the correct way, you do end up with these white elephant projects, which, in the immediate to medium term do not serve any real purpose for majority of citizens, and actually end up costing the citizens even more than the benefits, because most of these projects, particularly the big legacy projects, are financed through debt. So I think that's at the very fundamental level, that is the importance of public participation. The second point is about the social contract that exists between the citizen and the state. It is a disturbing trend that this social contract is being violated by external third parties, where governments feel that they do not need to be held to account, or do not feel the need to be accountable to citizens, but instead feel greater need to be accountable to their development partners. And I think when you start removing the ability and capability of the public and civil society to participate and offer alternative views and alternative perspectives, there is an erosion of that social contract, which then can disenfranchise society, it can disenfranchise citizens, and what you end up with is a potential social crisis where people have very little trust, very little faith in what their governments are doing, and there's a sense of hopelessness that can be arrived at by the general public, and it can also lead to unrest. We've seen this with the Arab Spring. We've seen this in Sudan, just up the road. When you isolate people from expressing their views and expressing their thoughts, that feeling of disenfranchisement and the erosion of the social contract can be quite devastating.
There's an advert that comes to mind that has a tagline of acting local, thinking global. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us don't, the average Kenyan thinks of their local circumstance. But I think we need to increasingly become aware how much of what we do locally is being determined by people who are sitting globally. So in the case, and the perfect case is the World Bank coming in, having discussions with government. We are not privy to that. Parliament isn't privy to that. Our parliament isn't strong on oversight. What are the interests of the bank that we should be mapping as civil society if we want to try and really take forward this bottom-up agenda? Because who do we need to convince? Since we have a constitution, they have their rules and laws, that they're then actually, like you said, they're violating their third parties violating our social contract despite their own rules. So who do we have to talk to? Jason, in your view?
So we have, I mean, the bank has its own mechanisms where, we can channel these concerns. For me, that's one avenue. I think increasingly also is to use creative and disruptive positively disruptive other mechanisms, like using the legal system to challenge some of these activities or some of these behavioral norms that many of our development partners and governments are perpetuating. So I think, Wanjiru, you mentioned the BBI. I think that's a very good example of, where people felt that there was a challenge potentially to the rights of Kenyan citizens to be part of this process in terms of how it was going to go forward. We've seen this with other civil society organizations that have successfully brought public interest litigation to the courts. I think in Kenya, in particular, there's a good moment right now with the judiciary where there seems to be some progressiveness to a degree and some level of braveness in tackling some of these issues and trying to hold the government to account in one way or another. For me, this is an alternative, particularly in the COVID-19 perspective or context, where you can't do public demonstrations because you might be harangued by the authorities for violating COVID-19 protocols. We need to start this creative disruption using different avenues. And as I said, I think, and also calling for greater accountability within the development financing institutions mechanisms. And this is something that has been going on at the global level for a very long time, to the extent even that these organizations are starting to listen, though the change is very slow.
In the room with you this morning is Eric Latif, Nduoko, Wajiro Gekonyo, and our listener Yegon, who is in the house. And on the line is Jason Braganza and Julius Kapwepwe, discussing governance gaps in the World Bank engagement with Kenya. Yegon.
Jason, last week we had an email towards the African Bank when Kristalina, who is the IMF director, outlined the three policies of making Africa return back. And one of the things was end the pandemic everywhere. Number two was help Africa deal with the growing debt burden. Now, in this point, my question is, they are saying that the G20 debt service suspension initiative has provided much need breathing space for Africa to come up with a common framework for debt resolution fully operational. So my question is, who is responsible now to come up with a framework policy on how to reduce the debt in Africa? And how does the G20 debt suspension service affect the African member countries?
Thanks. That's a very good question, actually. First of all, we need to acknowledge that despite the several goodwill messages that have come from different quarters and the different initiatives that have been announced since the start of the pandemic and the onset of the debt crisis, which, by the way, like I mentioned the last time I was on the show, the debt crisis is something that we were already heading towards, and the pandemic just accelerated the situation that we're in. To the main point, the initiatives are not good enough. And as AFRODAD and together with my friend Julius at UDN, we've been very clear in saying that the measures that have been put forward, such as the Debt Suspension Service Initiative, the G20's Common Framework, are not just good enough. Let me explain to you why. The Debt Suspension Service Initiative is exactly that. It's a suspension. It's not a cancellation. It's not a restructuring. It's a rescheduling. So it's been suspended and will need to be paid once this period is over, which is towards the end of this year. So from next year, governments that qualified for this debt service suspension initiative or applied for it will have to resume paying these debts. With the G20 Common Framework, the biggest issue with it is that it has it does not include commercial private creditors to developing countries, specifically in Africa. And the reason this is important is because over the last 10 or 15 years, the debt accumulation by our governments has changed very dramatically, and there's a larger proportion of our debt that is now owned by private and commercial creditors. And the fact that they are not part of these any of these initiatives is very problematic, because the risks we run is any debt restructuring or rescheduling or cancellation that we qualify for or we are able to negotiate will be rerouted to just offsetting the private creditors, and therefore the real net effect or net benefit that we would be getting from the space that's created by this restructuring or cancellation may not actually be felt. Now, to specifically your question about who should be doing it, it's us the citizens, together with our government, needs to take a step back and sit down and come up with a comprehensive proposal that gives us a stronger voice in these negotiations. For many decades, just like on other issues like tax or trade, we have found ourselves on the weaker end of the negotiating table, and so we sign up to agreements that are really binding, both financially but also legally, and to try and readjust and come out of those frameworks and agreements becomes very costly and very challenging, and it further ties our hands in that way. So we need to start thinking about a new way of doing things that gives a lot more negotiating strength and negotiating capacity to our government. And this is why AFRODAD, together with our friends at UDN, the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, and continentally, we have been calling for greater participation and greater voice of the public, of civil society organizations that have been working on these issues for several decades, to be on the table or at the table with the government to help it strategize, to help it develop stronger negotiating tactics that does not then lead to a situation where it loses its sovereignty. The African Union has also pronounced itself on this. They've come out very clearly saying that there needs to be another way of handling the current situation. So it's upon us to continue that fight, to continue voicing these concerns and voicing these ideas. Because what will end up happening is we'll be in the same cycle where we're signing up to these additional contracts through the IMF and the World Bank, which are loans in itself, as Wanjiru mentioned at the beginning of the show. And we'll continue just in this vicious cycle of constantly accumulating debt that needs to be repaid.
Julius, thanks so much, Jason, for that. I was hoping you'd mention the African Borrowing Charter, but maybe we'll come back to that. Julius, there's a word you said about the type of participation the World Bank does. I missed that. But my question is, what have you done as the Uganda Debt Network to open up the space for civil society, for the public in World Bank and other multilateral funded debt projects?
Yes, thank you. I inherently I want to begin by saying on what have you done. What we've done is to alert our citizens, not just in Uganda, but across East African community, the 6 states, that many of these struggles are rooted in the core and cause for social justice. So what the Didan Kimatis left us with, what the Kenyatta has left us with, the Tomboy has left us with, is Kambarage Nyerere and others, is what we are building on towards achieving, in principle. The second bit we've done is to knock at the doors of the powers that be. Alert Parliament that there is this proposal coming in about borrowing. We think it has this strength. We think it has these weaknesses. Please use your designated officers to address it. Unfortunately, as civil society actors, there is a limit to what we can exactly do. If an accountant general, say Nancy Gafungu, has been alerted that there has been an issue here around this debt-funded project, and her team doesn't do the conclusive elements as required under their designated offices, as civil society actors, there is a limit to what you can do. As you hear the word civil, we are not militants that if you don't, we shall come and shoot you off your chair. No, it is civil, the dialogue. So the dialogue is what we feel is legit, not only with the multilateral financial institutions, country offices, the African Development Bank, especially the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank that we are talking about at country level, but also at the regional level, whether in Tanzania, alerted the East African Legislative Assembly and the East African community structures about some of these concerns, but also about the good practices that are happening and encouraging those in offices that please proceed with this good practice, but also alerted those international financial institutions in Washington and elsewhere across the world. In Brussels, we've been there, the European Union, together with our friends under AFRODAD and many others, and have said this is our African position. The other bit on what we've done, then just building on what Jason has said, if you look at the current global regional, whether it's African community or SADC, and also later on at a respective national level, the bigger three challenges we face now as a region are around health and the social issues, the social crisis. Health because of the COVID situation, and the attendant social elements that come with that. If people are hungry and the government cannot quickly respond to their needs, and instead you are giving debt repayment or debt servicing the priority, it means you are potentially creating a hazard to political unrest across the respective countries. And we don't think that we should go that direction. The other bit then is the debt crisis that Jason highlighted. And amongst the many other positions we've taken incrementally is the call for total cancellation of all outstanding debts, beginning with the multilateral financial institutions, remembering also who are the owners. The owners are government of Kenya, the people of Kenya, the people of Uganda, the people of Tanzania, the membership, the 189 members across the world. So if we've borrowed and we've borrowed off our money literally, we think that this is the time we should be calling for total debt cancellation. Remember that those who want our gold and have always taken it, and it has ended up at Antwerp in Belgium, 10 times the cost. Those from Congo, from Uganda, from Kisumu areas to Beijing in China, those who have taken our coffee to make Nescafe and many others, those who have been taking our cobalt, our oil and gas, whether Total and many others, are the ones whose respective parent governments we are appealing to for total debt cancellation. We acknowledge there have been issues previously. Let us cancel 100%, give the Africans the breathing space. Then from there, we are able to build amicably on what would be kind of formidable.
Why would they?
And lastly, for me,
Sorry, Julius, what incentive? We can see it from the recipient point when you look at debt cancellation.
Yes.
But even if we are making this suggestion, and even at some point almost demanding such, how would it be beneficial to them to do it? And why would they acquiesce to such demands?
Our argument is that without Africa, the world cannot stand. Africa for a long time has been a gold mine for many of these global actors that contribute into the state coffers of their respective governments. So we are saying if you've taken our gold from Busia areas, whether on the side of Uganda or the side of Kenya, and across the African continent, whether it is the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere, our oil and gas, you've actually inherently paid yourself back tenfold already. So can we have a bit of breathing space? Because we are not going to do without Africa. Can we then channel that money into 100% vaccination against COVID for all the citizens? When you look at the Kenyan figures on those that have taken the first COVID jab, 1.84 million people out of the 45 plus, you can see what I'm talking about. So there is a mutual benefit if we took that direction. Of course, then the other bit, if you're talking about climate and environmental destruction reversals, the Africans, the East Africans, those in Southern Africa need money to invest into the recovery of water catchment areas as we talk about addressing global warming, which global warming has mainly been caused by those countries in the global north, in the United States, in Europe, and in China. And those are the very people we are appealing so that we can demonstrate where we would be able to put those resources through writing letters and appealing, and also facing with them directly. If we can't meet them at the country offices, we will do so through the African Union, and we have done, but also we've flown to Washington and been able to have interface meetings alongside our governments and even independently as civil society actors.
Thanks so much, Julius. Jason, we've got maybe another 4 minutes, and then we'll need to wind up. I was hoping that you'd mention, the Africa, is it the AU Borrowing Charter or the African Borrowing Charter? A little bit about that and how you hope it will help, deal with the present problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as in rounding up with from the conversation we've had on the issue of responsible borrowing and responsible lending, AFRODAD has come up with what we call the African Borrowing Charter, which sets out a set of principles to strengthen and enhance public participation in how debt and loan contraction is done by governments in particular. It is also a document that lays out principles on the conditions that should be in place, as governments consider contracting loans and debt financing to finance their development agenda. This looks at the broader economic state of the country. It looks at the legal framework of the country that can safeguard government from very predatory lenders, as well as provisions for public participation, transparency, accountability, and governance. It's worth saying things like having a debt management office are one of those principles encompassed in the charter, as well as having a public debt register or a debt bulletin that stipulates the kind of creditors that a government has on its books and the amounts and where these finances are being used. So these are the kind of principles that we have been advocating for the past 25 years. We continue to push and ask members of parliament to look at this document and incorporate some of the principles within the domestic legislation to strengthen the voice of the public in loan contraction, but also strengthen the government's position in its negotiation tactics with its creditors.
Jason, thank you very much for all those insights. Jason Braganza is the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODAD. And also we've heard on the line Julius Kapwepwe. He's the Director of Programs at the Uganda Development Network and also the Coordinator of the East Africa Budget Network. Gentlemen, asanteni sana for joining us this morning. Have a lovely day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Have a pleasure.
Asante sana.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.